Okay, thank you again, everybody, for coming and joining us. Our session today is about estate planning, basics of estate planning. We're going to talk about the importance of it, talk about some of the common documents and the purpose of those documents and how this fits in with the greater, really with some of the parts of the account functionality with things like beneficiary designations and how all these pieces really tie together. Okay, so but yeah, it's good to see you again. And one other thing before I forget, we will see you again very soon. We were able in the spring to come back for the first time. I know we saw some of you that are on this session. We saw some of you in the spring in person. First time in 2.5 years we were able to be on site. We will be coming out there again. The week of November 7th is the week that we have penciled in. So stay tuned. In the very near future, you will see what you always see, which is the scheduling links and the links to all of our time. But I know it's a busy time of year. It always is. It's open enrollment time and a few other things going on. But we will be there to meet with people individually. Okay. All right. So I'm going to cross my fingers and attempt this screen share in a way that hopefully behaves, but I have a bad feeling that it has a bad attitude. All right. Oh, wait a minute. I think it actually worked. Is that working? Okay. Thank you, Jen. I can see you nodding. All right. I take it back. It is behaving. So thank you. I think everybody here knows me. But I'm Mike Bassaro from StraightLine. Jason Fisher was not able to join us today. He's in some other meetings, but I know many of you know Jason as well. Amy Paisano from our office, I saw her name on here. So many of you have talked to Amy, particularly if you have scheduled anything directly with our office. So she's on to listen in as well. So jumping right into it. Estate planning is an interesting concept in the financial world. It's a very misunderstood concept. A lot of people think that that only certain people need it or only really rich people need it. But I'm here to dispel that myth right off the bat. So who needs estate planning? The answer is everyone, at least at some level. Okay, not everybody needs all of the pieces of what is commonly known as estate planning, but everybody needs to at least address these issues in some way. Okay, so we'll get into that more in just a second. So first off, I want to talk about what is your estate. It's a word that everybody has heard many times. It's a word that everybody has probably used many times, but not everybody really knows what it is. And it's in general, it's basically all of your assets, all of the assets that you would think it to be. So money that you have in the bank, stocks, bonds, your retirement accounts, your house, your jewelry, your art collection. I know everybody has the real Mona Lisa. That's why I used that picture, but it is basically anything of financial value minus debts that you might have is collectively known as your estate. Okay. And well, actually, before I go to that one, I want to jump right into one of the common myths about it. A lot of people think that they have to use estate planning to avoid the estate tax, the death tax, the whatever, there are different words for it. And the truth of it is, most people in the United States are actually not subject to estate taxes because estate taxes are a function of the size of your estate. And the amount of money that you are allowed to exempt to be exempt from the estate tax is pretty substantial. But even, I'm about to show you what that number is, but even if you don't have an estate that is the size that I'm about to show you, it doesn't mean that you can click off of this presentation. You have to stay on, because you got to stick with me for a little bit longer, because there are still things that apply to you, okay? But the estate tax itself in 2022 especially does not kick in until a pretty high level. So what is that level? It is just a shade over $12 million per person, okay? 12, and meaning if you are a married couple, you can exempt $24 million and change of assets before you start paying estate taxes. So most people in the United States do not have assets or do not have estates of the size that that are affected by this. Now, this level of exemption has changed dramatically over the years. And it has increased dramatically. So this just goes back to 1997. And at that time, it was only $600,000 per person. And it was actually quite easy to have estates over that size, because remember, this includes the value of your house, any other assets that you might have. But it has changed dramatically over time. And in fact, 2010, this is a little misleading. In 2010, it didn't actually exist. So people who died in 2010 didn't have, even if you were a multi-billionaire, and there were several in 2010 that actually passed away during a time when Congress didn't fix a problem in the rule that actually eliminated the estate tax during that one calendar year. This green line actually shows what the estate tax is. It's currently at 40%, and it has been there for some time. But again, to be clear, unless you have individual assets over $12 million or joint assets over $24 million and change in 2022, you don't have to do this to avoid that estate tax. Okay. Now, this is a bit of a political football. This has been discussed many times about dropping that level back down. There's a lot of numbers that have been thrown out. But unless they dropped it back to where they had it over in the late 90s, it was actually at $1 million for a number of years. Unless they were to drop it back down, the estate tax itself is not the driving force behind most estate tax planning issues. Okay. So, all right, jumping forward, a couple of reasons why this would happen, or excuse me, why you would need estate planning. And I'm getting a note that you're not seeing my screen any longer. Is that true? Are you still able to see the? Okay, so I'm sorry if there is if some people are not able to see it. I apologize for that. I think some people still are. By the way, and someone just mentioned this, and thank you. It's a good suggestion. What I just was showing here, this is federal estate tax. Depending on the state you are in, some state or the state in which you reside at the time you pass, some states also have estate tax at a variety of levels. Okay. But the numbers that I was showing, that's the federal exemption. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay. All right. So getting back to here, the primary function of estate planning, it is really to make sure that you control your assets, you control the decisions that are made about you, and it's not left to the probate process. It's not left to a judge, and you get to control what you have built up and who makes decisions for you. Okay. So that it is, we've all heard stories, we've all heard horror stories. Some of us, unfortunately, have had to deal with horror stories of estates that have not been planned properly. And it just creates a nightmare for people that are left behind. And usually they're left behind at a time when things can be very emotional and very difficult. So it's a huge gift that you can give to your family if you do these things in the correct way. And it's not nearly as complicated as a lot of people think it's going to be. Okay. So, why people don't do it, I think we all know. Sometimes it's just the momentum and inertia of this. It's not a real fun thing to talk about, because you are talking about your at least your incapacitation, and ultimately your demise. Human nature is that we don't typically like to talk about these things. But this is the planning and the communication of decisions can help tremendously. In many ways, it is one of the biggest gifts that you can give your heirs, of doing these plans and communicating them in ways that people can understand. Okay. And making sure that people who are there to be to oversee this process, the executors of the process that you nominate, know where stuff is. Whether a document locator is on your screen right now, that's actually a document that we have that we can give you, that just kind of helps you organize things or help you give enough information to another person so that they know where stuff is. But if you have nominated somebody to do this work for you, you want to make sure that they understand. And if you've made decisions, especially decisions that some people might not agree with, as painful as those conversations can sometimes be, that is what usually solves 95% of the problems that are there after someone passes away. And again, it just goes back to a generational gift that you can give your family, particularly if there are decisions that are not as linear as some people might expect. Okay. All right. So what are the consequences of doing this wrong? I already said, the court's making decision versus you or your designees. The probate process, which can be very long and painful for people who've had to go through with this. Fights between beneficiaries can be brutal, can rip families apart. It can actually create situations where assets are owned by individuals or entities that you don't intend to own them. There can be estate tax issues, again, depending on the size of the estate. And sometimes things just get locked up for so long that it can be a liquidity issue. This is especially true if part of your estate contains businesses or business interests that have value, but maybe that value is not cash that can be used to do this. You see these when plans are not followed through correctly. Sometimes leads to the liquidation of assets, just to pay, certain taxes or certain expenses, which can otherwise be avoided with proper planning. Okay. All right. So what are the primary documents? There are 4 basic documents with the traditional estate planning process: a will, 2 powers of attorney, the healthcare, financial and medical powers of attorney, and a trust. Okay. Now, most people know that word trust and they think that they need it. The thing about it is only 3 of these documents are really always required. Okay. And that is the will and the 2 powers of attorney. They are essentially always required for anyone at any asset level. The trust, and this surprises some people, is, I say, sometimes required. Okay. The need for a trust is really not dependent on the amount of money or the amount of assets that someone has. At some level, it becomes more important. But the need for a trust is much more of a function about your complexity rather than your asset size. Okay. Depending on the structure of your estate, you can have millions of dollars and not need a trust. And on the other hand, you can have almost no net worth whatsoever and still need a trust. It's about complexity rather than asset size, much more. Okay. So let's talk about the basic one. The first one, and this is one that we hope and pray that everyone has, is a will. And if I'm speaking to someone who is 22 years old and they've been out of college for 6 months and they have their first job, I'm still saying, yes, you need a will. Well, I don't have any assets. I know you may not have any assets quite yet. But having a will in place, if at least to guarantee who makes decisions or where certain things will go, even if you don't think you have any assets, a will is still important. Okay, but it controls what happens when you to the assets that you think. You get to determine where they go. These are simple documents to put together. We're actually going to talk about creation of these documents in just a minute. But a will is a very straightforward document. It is something that can often be done more or less on your own. You still need to make sure that it's verified and it's notarized and it's legal. But this doesn't have to cost millions of dollars to put together. Okay. But a will does have some limitations. I've mentioned beneficiaries, and for many people, regardless of age, the primary financial asset that people have is their retirement account, a 403b, a 401k, IRAs, whatever it is. When you have an account like that, a traditional retirement account that has a beneficiary designation, the will typically will not supersede the beneficiary designations. You have heard me and other people at StraightLine, and you've heard people from Principia talk to you about the importance of having your beneficiaries on file, right? Even if I can't see you, I know you're nodding right now. Everybody has said this. This is critically important. If you have a beneficiary designation that is on there, and you say, and then you do a will and you change your opinion, but it's in your will, but you do not change your beneficiaries, your will generally not matter for that asset. Okay. We have seen situations like this. We have seen situations, insurance policies, same kind of thing. We have seen people, let's say they were married young, right? And they have their spouse on there as their beneficiary. They get divorced. They forget about their insurance policy. They get remarried. They're remarried for 35 years. They pass away. This is a real story, by the way. They pass away and they never changed their initial beneficiary. Their first spouse that they hadn't talked to in 40 years got their life insurance proceeds. And their spouse that was on everything else was not able to change that beneficiary. That was not something that we worked with directly, but that was something that we saw and we witnessed after the fact. Beneficiary designations are incredibly important to the estate planning process because they are incredibly strong. All right. But in general, beneficiaries, contracts, and even a trust will typically supersede a will. Some people will say, well, I have a trust, do I need a will? Yes, you still need one, because the will, when you have a trust, basically the will functions just to dump assets into the trust, especially if you've acquired something that's not specifically listed. There are terms called spillover wills or pour over wills. Basically, they just exist to make sure that the trust is followed. Okay, but a will might be all you need for preparing for the ultimate end. Okay. What a lot of people don't think of, everybody thinks about estate planning is what happens if you die. Okay. Well, wills and trusts govern what happens if you die. But what a lot of people don't think of is, well, what happens if I'm alive, but I am unable to make my own decisions? I'm incapacitated in some way. That's where the powers of attorney come in. Okay. And these are, you hear that word power of attorney, and power of attorney can mean a couple of different things. These are durable powers of attorney. These are standalone documents that are created as part of an estate planning process. And basically, for financial and medical, and they are separate documents. This does not have to be the same person or persons, but basically you are designating the person or persons that you want to make decisions for you on financial and medical matters if you are not able to make those decisions yourself. Okay. The other thing, and these can be together or they can be slightly different documents, but things like advanced directives, often are part of the process of creating these powers of attorney. Whether you want medical intervention at all. Something that I know is a very significant issue, particularly in the Christian Science community. These are documents that most people are typically familiar with. Everybody has their own interpretation of them, and there's no right or wrong answers to this. But if you have feelings about what you want done or what you do not want done, these are things that have to be documented ahead of time. Okay, so financial and medical powers of attorney will be part of an estate planning process, along with the will in essentially all cases. Okay. Now the trust. I've already said that the trust is the trust is a slightly more involved document than the will. Again, governs what happens if you die. But these can cover much more advanced situations than you can with a traditional will. Okay, so a trust, when you create a trust, what you are creating is a legal entity that owns your assets. Okay, now you retain full control as what's called the grantor of the trust, the person or persons in the case of a married couple. The persons that are putting these assets into the trust, that are essentially giving them to the trust, you still have full control, but technically the trust owns it. Well, why? Okay, you've always heard, many people who've heard anything about this, you hear, oh, well, the trust avoids probate. It does. The reason why trusts avoid probate is because trusts can't die. Trusts are immortal, unlike us. Right? So when we own assets as human beings, eventually the human being will pass away. The trust does not. The trust is what governs your assets, of course, based on your wishes. Okay, so that is effectively the purpose of these things, is you're avoiding that whole estate process. You're avoiding that part of the probate process, because the entity that owns them is not you anymore. It's this legal entity that you have created and that you control. Okay, so situations that typically need a trust. I've already said it a million times already today, complex assets. The more complex your situation is, which, if you, again, especially business entities or unconventional assets, without, or something that requires specific changes in ownership that are a little bit more unusual, you're going to almost always want to trust, regardless of asset size. Okay, what is not a complex asset, by the way? In most cases, retirement accounts, regardless of size, are not complex assets in this context because they have beneficiary designations, right? We've already covered that. Your house is not often considered a complex asset. If you have a $30 million house, it's a complex asset. But it's actually not as complex as you might think. It's still a legal thing that you control, and you control the deed to it, and you can control the deed to it moving forward. But if it's massively valuable, then it gets to be a little bit more complex. Okay. High asset level estate, that's essentially what I just said. I'm going to do this in a slightly different order. You can see the picture. Some of you recognize that. Modern family. This is probably the most common use of a trust when people think that their situation isn't otherwise that complex, or maybe their asset levels are not approaching those levels where the estate tax would kick in. In the event of second marriages, kids that are children of one spouse but not the other, it creates some situations where there's not necessarily a clear lineage, if you will, of how assets will pass along. That doesn't make it hard, it doesn't make it unusual, but it makes it a situation where you often have to kind of step in to make sure that your wishes are followed. Okay, the special needs trust, this is a slightly different situation, and it's one that is really there can be a lot of complexity here. But this kicks in when you have a family member, often a child, but not necessarily, but you have a family member that requires special needs. Or that has special needs, requires certain kinds of specialized care. That is, but that person may not be in a position to make these decisions for themselves. They may not be in a position to control these types of assets in a way that is in their best interest going forward. Okay, a special needs trust is a specialized type of document where you can create those instructions, you can fund those instructions beyond your own demise, and make sure that assets are cared for in a way that allows them to then care for the individual. Okay, so if you do have a special needs situation in your family, estate planning becomes infinitely more important. Okay, so that's but again, that's I could go off for hours and hours just on that subject alone, as you could with many of these. But if you remember nothing else, if you do have a special needs situation, you need to make sure that this is put in place. Okay, particularly when it's a much younger family member, a child or someone else. So very quickly, just to kind of, I don't want to go through all of these, but just to kind of have this on the screen, and it'll be there for the recording as well. But the assets that can be put in trust are most of the assets that you would probably think of off the top of your head. Cash accounts, after-tax investment accounts, non-retirement investment accounts, certain kinds of annuities, stocks, bonds, business interests, all of those things can be put in trust. The types of things that are not included typically in trust, most of the time, you'll recognize some of these things. I've talked about them already. What do they have in common? Most of them have beneficiary designations. Okay, so one more time, the beneficiary designations govern this. Now, there can be situations where your trust is your beneficiary, okay, on a retirement account. Typically, it's if you're married, you don't want your trust as your primary beneficiary. There's a lot of reasons for that. Again, it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, something that we can definitely talk to you about. But in many cases, your trust can be listed often as a contingent beneficiary if you are married. But the assets that have beneficiary designations are not actually placed in the trust. The trust can still govern them, though, if your situation requires it. Right? So finally, what to avoid with these things. Number one is overpaying. Okay, we get this question a lot of how much should I pay for this? And I already mentioned you can do some of this stuff almost on your own. The more complex your situation, the more it's going to typically cost. And where you are, sometimes even the city you live in determines how expensive this is. I can give you examples from our home area, and I know this personally, where I have seen, situations where a full estate plan costs $2,000 and another one that does the exact same thing that happens to be in a particular suburb costs $8,500, and it does the exact same work. The larger your estate, the more complex your estate, the more you should expect to pay. And I think at some level, there's always an expression, you never want the cheapest brain surgeon, right? You don't want to pay $50 for these things. You probably can do some of them that are online. You can do very, very cheaply. But you don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on these things. But something, that is in that, hundreds to low thousands is often what you end up paying for this. But again, situations and locations can make that number vary quite a bit. What to avoid: dying intestate. Dying intestate just simply means that you die without a will. Okay, you die without any directions in place, and can kind of unleash chaos. I've had many people tell me, well, I don't really care, I won't be here to deal with it anyway. That's okay, that's allowed, but in terms of the damage that can do to a family, the damage that can do to people that you love, it's something that is a tremendous investment that you can make, and a tremendous gift that you can give. Another thing that we hear all the time: oh, well, I don't need to do estate planning because I just have my kid's name on my bank account and my kid's name on this account or that. That can work in certain situations, but that can cause some serious unintended consequences. Even when, now the obvious one is when the kid goes rogue and does whatever they want. The problem with having a kid's name, let's say the kid that would, let's say you have multiple kids, and even if they get along well, and you have one that is going to be the executor of this, and that they're going to do the right thing and they're going to get the assets to their siblings. So we just take that kid and put their name on all of our investment accounts, and we have 3 kids and we have $300,000 in investments in cash. Okay. The problem with that, even if that kid doesn't go rogue, but part of the problem is that kid owns it. Okay. It's theirs. If you pass away and they're on the account, it's theirs legally. Even if their intent is to get it to their siblings, the problem is now it's legally viewed as a gift from that person, not from you. And that causes problems to the kid. Okay. So just having kids' names on assets or names on the house, you have one kid and that's your intention, sometimes that can work. But be very, very cautious about just putting somebody else's name on things without, at the very least, speaking with an attorney to make sure that's the way that it's best suited. Okay. And I know I've hit this, the final thing on there, I know I've hit this a couple of times, and I'm going to hit it one more time because of how important it is. For most people, the largest assets that you have, the largest financial assets, maybe outside of your house, are often assets where traditional estate planning can't stand on its own. Okay. If your largest asset is your retirement account, you have to change your beneficiaries to make sure that it matches up to where you want this money to go. Changing your beneficiaries takes about 45 seconds, but it is a tremendous problem and an almost unsolvable problem if it is incorrect at the time of your passing, if it's incorrect for your beneficiaries that expect it to be there. Okay, so I promised you about a half hour. We started a few minutes late, so I'm at about 31 or 2 minutes. But this is our information. So if you'd like to anytime reach out to us, that's the best way to do it. That website in a very short time will also have the active scheduling link for our sessions that are coming up in November. But you don't have to wait for those sessions in November. You can always call us. We are always here to have discussions, phone, Zoom, whatever it is. But we will be in person on site here in just a few weeks. Okay. So, all right. So with that, I will stop my part of it here. I'll stop the share here for a second. And just ask, does anybody have any questions? You can feel free, you can write them in the chat, you can take yourself off of mute, and feel free to ask away. Anything? It was just so thorough that I've covered everything in detail, right? Yes, I can see everybody nodding, even if you're not on screen. Okay. What the obviously all of these subjects, this is just really skimming the surface of these subjects. So there's a lot of things that are unique to every person's situation, and certainly something that we can. I see a couple questions coming in. I'll get to them in just one second. But it's certainly something we can provide some guidance. We are not attorneys. We can't create trusts, but we can certainly help you through the process and help you think through it. Okay. So a couple of questions have come through. One of the questions, good one. What does it mean to fund a trust? It's a great question. And it can mean a couple of different things, but essentially funding a trust means it means typically changing the title of an asset to make sure that the trust controls what happens with it. Okay, so in some cases it can mean changing. The simplest description is your bank account. Right now, most of you have a bank account that's either in your own name or maybe in joint name with a spouse or something like that. When you put a trust in place, it is common that you would actually retitle the account, investment accounts too, non-retirement investment accounts. You would actually retitle the account to the name of the, John and Jane Smith Family Trust. Okay, John and Jane Smith are the ones that have control of that trust, but the registration of the account is actually in the name of it. So if something happens to John and Jane, it means that the trust will govern that. Okay. Sometimes it can mean changing beneficiary designations to make sure that the trust is reflected. But I want to be very, very clear about this. Even when you have a trust in place, it doesn't always mean that your trust should be one of your beneficiaries on a retirement account. That's something that your attorney would guide you through based on the wishes that you've put in place. Okay. But funding a trust essentially means putting money into it, and it's an important process, or excuse me, putting assets into it or listing assets that should be part of it in some cases. Okay, so it's a very important part, because if you go through the process of creating the whole document and the expense of going through and creating it, but then you don't actually put anything in its name, it will often still make it, and it doesn't mean that your wishes won't be followed, but it creates a lot more work and hassle for the people that you have designated, or the person that you have designated, to actually control the assets after you pass. Okay. Couple of other questions coming in. How do you recommend choosing a tax advisor to help with creating your retirement and estate plans? It's a great question. And it's I would say it's not just a tax advisor or an accountant. It's an attorney as well. And sometimes the roles can kind of cross over, but the attorney has to actually create the estate plan. It is very common for estate attorneys to have a lot of background in tax. I happen to know a couple of estate attorneys that are actually also accountants. Because there's a lot of overlap between the functions. But estate attorneys tend to be fairly specialized. And I think the best thing you can do is to speak with a few of them and trust your gut, trust your feelings, and ask questions. Probably the best advice I can give you for any type of advisor, even a financial advisor, even that includes us. If someone is not willing to answer your questions, okay, that might be the 50th time they've answered that question in that day. If they're not willing to answer your questions in a way that makes you comfortable, in a way that makes you understand them, you don't need to keep talking to them. Okay, this is something, most estate planning for an attorney is pretty straightforward. A lot of the language that you get in most documents is pretty boilerplate language. But that doesn't mean that it's routine to you. Okay. Most of us deal with this stuff once, or a couple times in their life. The attorney or the accountant that you're speaking with might deal with it 15 times in one day. Make sure that your feel for them that your feel for them is good, and trust it. Okay. Unfortunately, with most estate plans, you don't really, there's not a really great way to test them because they don't really go into place until someone is gone. But asking people who have dealt with these things or who have had family members pass away where they were the executors to see how those documents have worked and how the process has worked, that can be a great way to do it as well. Okay. And then look at cost. You know, if the cost is outrageous and someone wants to charge you $10,000 for the basic 4 documents, you should probably keep looking. Okay. A couple other questions coming in. Let's see, we're also told, yes. Okay, good. There is a good point here. We were told by an estate planner that a big difference between a will and trust is that wills are public and trusts remain private. So that is something to think about. That's a great point. Part of the reason is because, again, remember, when things are in trust, the trust didn't die. Therefore, it doesn't go through the probate process, which can be a public process. So that's a very good point. There can be a lot of reasons to create these documents and to create a trust, but often that can factor into it. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. Sorry to have joined late. Will this presentation be available to view later? The answer is yes. It is being recorded, and it will be available on our our new YouTube channel, which has been up and running. I know YouTube is not anywhere close to new, but having our own channel is a little bit new to us. So yes, we will have that, and we will make sure that the link is out there. Oh, and the question was answered. Thank you. I didn't even scroll down to see the answer. Will StraightLine will offer references? Yeah, can we offer direct references? Yes, we do. We do actually. The thing about estate planning and the legal aspect of it is it is very much tied to your location. Okay, the state in which you live or in which you plan to live is very relevant for these things because there can be differences. There are differences with some of these things state to state. So when you have an estate plan created, you typically want to make sure, well, no, you need to make sure that the attorney that you are speaking with is registered in your state. Okay, so we do have some connections that are local to Principia. Being on the east side or the west side of the border, you know, being in Illinois versus Missouri actually makes a difference. We're based in Michigan. We have quite a few contacts here. We do have a few entities that we know, a few firms that we know out there that where we can recommend some things. We don't have quite as many connections in Missouri or Illinois as we do in Michigan or Florida. By the way, pretty much any attorney in a northern state also tends to be registered in Florida because they don't want to lose half their client base when they retire. But anyway, factoring that in, long answer to a short question, it's really answering even more of the question than was asked. Yes, we can give some recommendations. But you also have to consider where you are and where you might like to be. That's the other thing. If you have an estate plan and you move to another state, it's a good idea to have an attorney just double check it and make sure there's not any tweaks that need to be made. Okay. Another question just came in. In the absence of a dedicated power of attorney for finance or health, would it default to a spouse? I am not an attorney, so I can't say this definitively. And even if I was an attorney, I still couldn't say it definitively. The answer is usually yes, but it's not always guaranteed. And I would say that especially when it's not a first spouse and you have adult children, that's where things can get a little bit tricky. So that's going to be the default that most of the time would happen. But there is no way to say this, what's in my head right now without sounding negative, but without sounding like I'm about to cause problems. But I don't mean this always in a negative way. Sometimes the spouse isn't the person that you want to make those decisions. Okay, maybe it's financial, maybe it's medical, maybe your spouse is not someone who is really comfortable with those decisions or would not be able to make those decisions. So while the answer to that question is often yes, and in most cases that's what people would want, it's not always the natural progression that people would like to follow. Okay, so it's still just simpler and cleaner to have it in place. And particularly when it comes to, financial, you have to think about this as well. When you're not able to make decisions or not comfortable making those decisions, even people who have said their whole life, oh, when I'm there, I won't try and do that. Well, we've seen this, unfortunately. And then all of a sudden, as age continues to advance, they may not actually be in the best position to recognize that they're not in the position to do it. And their spouse may not be in the best position to recognize that. Okay. So, these are all different scenarios that can, where having the spouse as a default, even if there's nothing bad going on and there's lots of love there and everybody wants to do the right thing, it may not be what is ultimately best suited for your situation. Okay. So anyway, yeah, most of the time it is going to default that way, and that's the way that people would want it. But it is better to have it put in place and to make it official, especially if something happens that's unexpected. Okay. So I think I covered all of the questions here in the chat. And if anybody has any others, I'll wait another minute. And again, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. But thank you for all the questions. This is excellent. So, any others out there? All right. Well, with that, once more, thank you for joining in today. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask privately, please feel free to reach out, and keep an eye out for our communications that are coming out through HR. And if you we look forward to meeting with you in person. For some of you, it's been a little while since we were able to see you face to face, so we're looking forward to it. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.